You're listening to Paranormal Patio. I'm Jason, as always. If you're just stumbling across this episode, make sure you check out paranormalpatio.com for links to all of our episodes. You can also find us on Spotify and almost every other major podcast distribution app or website, except for Apple. It's a personal decision. My guest tonight will be Seth Breedlove of Small Town Monsters. And we're going to talk about Small Town Monsters as a whole, some of his personal experiences, a little bit about the Mammoth Cave System. And it's a great episode, great interview. Seth was awesome. And I hope you guys all enjoy. So without further ado, here we go.
You're listening to the Paranormal Patio Podcast. Pull up a chair.
Welcome back to the Paranormal Patio Podcast. As always, I'm Jason. My guest tonight, Seth Breedlove of Small Town Monsters. Seth, welcome to the show.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for coming on. I'm excited to talk to you. Let's start off. Talk about Small Town Monsters. For people who are unaware.
Small Town Monsters is a film production company that I started in 2015. Our first movie was Minerva Monster, which was a documentary about a rural Bigfoot sighting in a small town near where I grew up in Minerva, Ohio. And from there we just grew, and now we make multiple productions per year. 2021 we're doing 7 different projects. So we typically had been doing 3 per year, and this year it's 7, so it's kind of a big year.
Yeah. How do you have time? Because these are full-length, feature documentaries. How do you have time to do so many in a year?
Well, there's 4 full-length docs, and then there's 3, I guess you'd say smaller projects, although when it's all done on the Trail of Hauntings will be a lot longer than the films, because there's multiple episodes spread out over the course of the year. So I don't know how we do the time thing. I mean, this is my full-time job, so every day is sort of split. For me, I go into the office and I start working on one project, and at the end of the day, I'm usually working on another project entirely. So one day I'm editing, and the next day I'm doing pre-production work or post-production, work on something. We do multiple podcasts as well. And yeah, so it's pretty much just splitting your day up and working hard, and we've been doing it that way for 5 years. I mean, there's also a very large, crew involved in Small Town Monsters. There's multiple people that help out. Aaron Gaskin works for us and works in the office, and he's always editing and working on stuff for Small Town Monster Squad, which is like our YouTube channel membership. And then we have other people. Today at the office we actually shot a scene, like a wrap-up scene for On the Trail of Hauntings episode 2, and then we had a meeting about episode 4, and so there's a lot of juggling that takes place, just juggling different projects.
I'm sure. So do you just have a map up in the office and you just throw darts to decide what are we going to do next?
Not really, but it's not far off either. I think we usually are about a year or 2 out on choosing projects as far as what we're working on next. I think Bell Witch is the furthest in advance that we had picked a project. We had actually started doing preliminary pre-production stuff on Bell Witch back in 2017, and that just came out in December of 2020. So,
right.
But I've got, I'm already kind of figuring out what the production slate will be for 2022 now that we've got 2021 locked in.
My goodness.
Right now we're trying to expand the YouTube content. We've got the members only section, but we're going to launch a free YouTube series later this year as well called Beyond the Trail, with Alexander Pedikov. And that's going to be kind of I don't know I haven't seen it yet is the thing. I'm producing it, so I'm not privy to everything that's going on with it. But the way Alex and I had talked about it in the pre-production meetings was kind of like a bushcraft and Bigfoot kind of series. He just goes out and interviews people and actually stays in locations where Bigfoot has been seen, and he's kind of actively looking for it. So that'll be on YouTube later this year. And that was kind of like a spontaneous thing. On the Trail of Hauntings was honestly a pretty spontaneous series as well. We just kind of came up with that in an afternoon while Santino was doing color grading on another project on Bell Witch. We just kind of hit on this idea of doing it on the Trail of Haunting series. And we were talking about Hauntings today because Hauntings is the first ongoing Small Town Monster series. Like On the Trail of UFOs or On the Trail of Bigfoot, they were shot episodic, but they were filmed in either quick bursts or they were filmed kind of like over an extended period of time. On the Trail of Hauntings, we're literally like, whenever we have a day, we go out as a crew and we make an episode. And it's been, we filmed 3 of the episodes now for that. And so it's an entirely different process from what we're used to working, but it's extremely fun because that series is very laid back and we're kind of just jumping in a car and going off to do this stuff. So, but this year, the big plan is to continue growing the amount of content being put out. And we're doing that by bringing in, kind of other filmmaking voices, especially in like the editing arena. Cause I know Dave Knopp, who did some cinematography on the Trail of UFOs Dark Sky. He is going to edit on the Trail of Lake Michigan Mothman, and Santino is doing On the Trail of Hauntings, and Alex is doing Beyond the Trail. So I'm handling 4 projects, and they're handling the other 3. The other thing to keep in mind is I was actually editing On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Journey I started in November, so that comes out this year, but it was technically kind of we were working on it in 2020. But as far as like what we pick and how we pick it, it's also based on just kind of like what appeals to me at the time. It's a little different with the On the Trail of projects because those are more phenomenon based rather than story based, if that makes sense. So like on the Trail of UFOs, Dark Sky, I mean, it's a UFO film, that's set in West Virginia and jumps around a ton from, UFO cases to Men in Black to Injured Cold. I mean, it's probably going to be like an hour and 45-minute long movie once it's all done just because there's so much ground to cover. But, that's very different from something like Howl of the Rougarou, which is going to be a very, concise look at the werewolf or dogman subject in Louisiana. I refer to them as the films, but I guess you would say like the Small Town Monsters Presents films as opposed to the On the Trail of films. The Small Town Monsters Presents films are kind of picked based on, I guess what appeals to me in terms of the witnesses and their stories, and then whether or not we have thoughts on how to approach that particular subject matter or story in a way that can be exciting visually, because those have become very, I don't know if I'd say intense, but it's a very different process from On the Trail of. On the Trail of is really just like picking up cameras and going out and making something. And the STM Presents movies have become very, they're just very visual. Like we have to come up with unique ways to tell those stories and make them all stand apart on their own. On the Trail of, we can kind of keep the same tone and mood from project to project. And with STM Presents, I'm always trying to switch it up. Like, Bell Witch doesn't really feel or look like the Mothman Legacy, and the Mothman Legacy didn't really feel or look like Momo. So we like to keep that, I guess challenging ourselves.
That's something that I've always noticed, because I haven't seen all of them, but I have seen probably 80%. Mm-hmm. And I've always noticed that it's like each film kind of has its own sort of visual tone. So the work that you're doing is not for nothing. People recognize it.
Yeah. The other thing about that is like the crew is, I would say on the actual crew, like the regular crew that goes out and films the movies, there's usually me and maybe one other person on the crew that are even into like cryptids and the paranormal. And,
really?
And the rest of them, the rest of them are just into filmmaking. And most of the crew I'm really good friends with. Some of them I grew up with. And so we just enjoy doing stuff together and making movies. So the number one goal is always just storytelling rather than like, I guess pushing some sort of paranormal agenda, because there really is no agenda. And, I think like Santino, who does our special effects, or Zach, who's the director of photography, those guys are much more interested in like, how can we do something interesting and new and really, try to again, just like challenge ourselves, cause it would be really easy to just do, like, after we made Mothman at Point Pleasant, which is like probably the biggest success story we've had, it would have been really easy to just do that every movie. And I know there's people who would argue we do, but our next movie after the Mothman at Point Pleasant was Invasion on Chestnut Ridge, which was a very different movie. I mean, the Mothman at Point Pleasant was all about Mothman sightings around Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and Invasion on Chestnut Ridge is like a movie where instead of being a concise look at, like one monster, Invasion on Chestnut Ridge is a look at multiple phenomena taking place in one geographical region. And just stylistically, the two were, kind of polar opposites. Mothman at Point Pleasant is very just straightforward and grounded, and Invasion on Chestnut Ridge was pretty stylized. It was I think that was the first movie where I consciously was like trying to create, a very specific like style out of the gate. But I mean, after Invasion was the Flatwoods Monster, which took us in a completely different direction from Invasion. And then we switched it up again with Bray Road Beast, which didn't even... I mean, Bray Road, from an editing standpoint, was unlike anything I had ever done before, and just totally different editing style. And a lot of that is also, like Santino and some of the other effects people, they want to do different things. They don't just constantly want to be creating one style of effect. Santino likes to work with stop motion and creating sets and sort of integrating like CG with practical, and he's capable of doing all that. And if every film was just kind of like the Mothman legacy, where he was taking my live action stuff and then adding in a CG monster. If we had just done the exact same thing with Mark of the Bell Witch, I think he would have got bored. But we did something completely different with Mark of the Bell Witch, where Santino shifted from like special effects to actually being director of photography of the recreations, and then the bulk of his effects work in Mark of the Bell Witch went from being like animating a Mothman to painting out like light switches and light bulbs, from the recreations from the house, because it needed to be, a period appropriate 1800s house.
I want to just say, Mothman at Point Pleasant and Invasion of Chestnut Ridge are two of my favorites.
Cool.
I love the retro kind of feel for Chestnut Ridge, because like the cover art is amazing. Mm-hmm. It just takes you right back in time. It's so cool. The bright pink and
it's got like such a specific like mood to it as well, which the mood of that movie was entirely influenced by, I grew up in this tiny town in Ohio called Bolivar, which is maybe like the closest, it was like 25 minutes south of Canton, which where the Pro Football Hall of Fame is, but it's in the middle of nowhere. And for some reason as a kid, we had like rabbit ears on our TV, and I can remember we would put that TV on the kitchen table and we would watch basketball or whatever, but we'd always end up watching like the news. And the news was always coming out of Wheeling, West Virginia, instead of like Cleveland or whatever. And I just remember as a kid even thinking that the Ohio Valley was such a weird place, because the mood of that area is so bizarre. And so I remember when we were making Invasion on Chestnut Ridge, I was really trying to capture the mood of being a kid watching the nightly news from Wheeling, West Virginia TV news station. And I remember having conversations with Jason and Zach while we were making that movie about, we would drive through these towns in Pennsylvania while we were making Invasion, and you would see there'd be like a video store, like a VHS, like, you know, I'm assuming they had DVDs, but you never know, because it looked like it was like trapped in time. Yeah. And so when we were making the movie, I was drawing, I think we all were drawing on all these things, like that sort of like retro 80s weirdness that seems to, some parts of Pennsylvania and West Virginia are still like, it's like they're trapped in the 80s and 90s. It's very, very weird. And I wanted to kind of integrate that same mood into that movie. It's funny too, because a lot of people really love that movie. Like, that's probably, it's not one of our most successful movies, like financially, but it's the one I think I hear from the most that people really respond to.
Yeah, I loved it. I've watched it probably 4 times, I think.
Cool.
Every time I watch it, I find something else that I have to look up, like pause and then spend 2.5 hours down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, it's a good introduction movie. Like, it doesn't go very in depth on any one thing, but I feel like it's like, if you want to if someone has been into, like, say, UFOs or Bigfoot, and you want to like really push them into the weirder side of things, like, that's the movie to unload on somebody, because it like gives you just enough that it's like a teaser of like all that the paranormal has to offer.
Is that by design?
I don't think so. I remember when we were making that movie, there was a conversation. We pulled up. We're filming. Our first day of filming, we shot 5 interviews. That movie had an insanely condensed shooting schedule. I think it was 3 days to shoot the whole movie. I remember that we had been shooting interviews all day, and it was like every kind of interview you can imagine. Like, we did an interview with a guy that said he saw like a pterodactyl, and we did an interview with a Bigfoot witness, and then we had done something else, and then we're like pulling up into Kecksburg, and we pull up in front of the Space Acorn statue, and we're going to interview a Kecksburg witness. And I remember Jason, one of the crew members, said to me, he's like, so these interviews are really cool and everything, but he's like, what does any of this have to do with the next thing? He's like, how are you tying all this together? And it was like one of those moments where for some reason I just knew I'd do it. I assumed in the edit I would pull it all together. And so like, one thing you learn is like, when you're leading these types of like shoots, is it's probably not great for everyone to know that you have no idea what you're doing, even though I rarely do. And so I just like BS'd out of nowhere, and I was like, yeah, you know how like Mothman is the main monster in the Mothman of Point Pleasant? Well, Invasion on Chestnut Ridge is the monster. And so that seemed to work. And from there, it kind of like cemented for me what we were doing and how I was going to make it work. And then it became about, okay, well, this isn't about like any one creature. It's about a place, and the place itself is a very weird place, and it's basically like a Bermuda Triangle documentary, but set in the Chestnut Ridge. And so it was, I don't think it was by design that it acts that way, but yeah, I think it is. I think it can be a really good like intro to the weirder side of this stuff. Yeah, absolutely. So along with that, and you kind of said the Chestnut Ridge is the monster, your level of seriousness notwithstanding, it does lend a lot to Keel's unification theory, that all these things just kind of present themselves as a facet of the same thing. Mm. Do you prescribe to that, or do you think this is all individual, separate things? When it comes to Bigfoot, I set that apart. I'm not a paranormal Bigfoot person, personally. Like my personal opinion on like Bigfoot is that it's some sort of undiscovered ape, and that is based on hundreds of years of eyewitness reports that seem to indicate that is the case, and it also has to do with my own experiences. But as for everything else, I don't know. Like, as, you know, UFOs and Mothman and, you know, whatever the hairy creatures were that were on the Chestnut Ridge, I don't know if it's all connected. I don't know how much of it is misidentification and how much of it is genuine, how much of it is real, like people having actual encounters. And, you know, there's so many weird aspects to something like the Chestnut Ridge stuff that it definitely sort of it makes you question it makes you ask all those questions, and definitely, like, I wish Keela had spent some time looking into the ridge. You know, like I actually need to ask Stan next time I talk to him if he ever like conversed with Keel, because it seems like they should have been like buddies. But yeah, I don't know that I subscribe to a lot of Keel's stuff. I think he pulled at threads and then maybe like pulled too hard or something and went. I just feel like a lot of the times Keel went down a rabbit hole. I was just talking to someone about this the other day. I just feel like sometimes he would go off he'd go off the deep end on certain things. And I think the danger with Keel became that he allowed himself to become a part of the stories he was sort of objectively supposed to be covering.
Yeah.
And, but I mean, you can't downplay the work he did either. I'm not critiquing him, but yeah, I don't know. I don't think I'm like in the camp that everything's connected. And at the same time, I think a lot of it probably is in some way connected. If that's the most cop-out answer I can possibly give, but that's my answer.
That's your Kecksburg answer. I get it.
I'm sorry, but like one thing that is interesting, or you said Kecksburg, one thing that does, you know, I mean, if nothing else, one incident can tie all these various incidences can be tied together simply because, from a witness standpoint, one witness sees another witness willing to talk about their experience, and that opens up the floodgates for all the other people who might have had experiences to talk about what happened to them. So in a way, I mean, it is all connected simply because at the very base level, like, witnesses feel more comfortable coming forward with their own, you know, encounters if they see other witnesses. And maybe that's what happens on the ridge, is like so many people see so many strange encounter stories, you know, sort of come out through researchers like Stan Gordon, and they're willing to talk about theirs. That doesn't, obviously that's not an explanation for what's actually going on, but in terms of like how it's all tied together, that's probably the biggest thing that stands out to me.
Yeah, that's a good explanation. You mentioned that your basis of the Bigfoot thing being a undiscovered ape species is kind of based on your own experience. Can you talk about that at all?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of two-part. One would be my experiences with witnesses. I've interviewed more Bigfoot witnesses than any of the other phenomena we've covered, and I have yet to really, well, I'm saying that now, I'm trying to rack my brain before I go any further and say something I'm not right about. I don't think I've interviewed a witness who had a paranormal Bigfoot encounter yet, which is saying something when we've interviewed as many people as we have. You know, and they exist, like, they're out there, the people that have had those experiences. I haven't talked to them. There's a really telling line in On the Trail of Bigfoot in the first series or the first movie where Don Keating says, you know, Don Keating's this Bigfoot researcher from Ohio who looked into Bigfoot for like 40 years. And in that time, he didn't take a single report that involved any kind of paranormal aspect. It was all, you know, pretty pretty basic flesh and blood Bigfoot kind of stuff. And I know right now the big thing is to talk about there being a preponderance of reports that are ignored or overlooked that involve paranormal aspects to the Bigfoot subject. But the fact is that there isn't a preponderance of those reports. There isn't a majority of reports. Most reports of Bigfoot are of a fairly fleeting, mundane variety. You know, most of them are people seeing something hairy and large cross the road in front of their car, or behind their house at night, or whatever the case may be. It's all, not all, but they're for the most part, that's what a traditional Bigfoot report is. So it's possible to me that maybe what you're dealing with on, say like the George Kowalczyk sighting on Invasion on Chestnut Ridge, which is the two creatures in the field, and then he fires the gun, and then the UFO or whatever shows up. I mean, maybe that's something else entirely. Like maybe it's mimicking, maybe whatever that phenomenon is mimicking a Bigfoot, or maybe it's something else entirely. When I say my own experiences, what I'm mostly referring to is just what has happened to me, what happened to me in 2018 in the Ouachita National Forest in Oklahoma, when we were shooting the Area X episode of On the Trail of Bigfoot, which is, it boils down to, we had a ton of activity spread over like 48 hours, screams and talking and all sorts of weird stuff. But I mean, the biggest part of that was that at like 2:00 in the morning, something threw rocks and screamed, at our tent, and then let out this really weird laugh, like gibbon-like laughter. And the thing that I took away from that was what was in the woods that night seemed to very much be a large primate. Like it's difficult to explain to someone too, because they're like, well, you heard something, but what I heard seemed to be a natural animal existing in its natural environment, doing what it does. It had a personality. It seemed to be kind of enjoying the fact that it had hit the roof of this metal outbuilding with this rock, and then it let out this gibbon-like scream and laughter, and it really reminded me of a primate. And everything we experienced while we were in there reminded me of primate, including there's an incident where we were on a hike back in the woods. We had actually gotten lost, this is not a place you want to get lost. There's like everything in those woods wants to kill you. There's rattlesnakes that have adapted to the point where they no longer have rattles. Yeah, and then there's black bear, there's boar, wild hogs. There's everything short of like dragons in those woods. And so you don't really want to be lost in there. But we were lost, and we were wandering around, and we kept coming across this like scent. It was really strong, but it was weird because you would walk into it and it would be there for a second, then you'd walk out of it and it's gone, and we kept hitting it. And we came to think that we were like in those moments, we were either downwind or something was moving ahead of us or something. We went to the Cleveland Zoo about maybe like 2 months later. It might not have even been that long. And I smelled that exact same smell again at the gorilla enclosure. And I thought that was really interesting. It was such a like specific smell, like animal smell. And most animals, have their own, like horse sweat has a very specific scent. This was a very specific scent, It's I've smelled bear when we were in the Smokies twice, and this wasn't like that. It genuinely it smelled exactly like the gorilla enclosure in August, when it's hot and muggy, and that's exactly what it smelled like.
That sort of like grassy BO smell.
Yeah, that exactly. Yeah, it is like a really strong BO.
Yeah, and you guys are wandering around lost out in the woods, probably all sweating, thinking it's you, like every one of you is thinking, man, I stink.
Yeah.
With a lot of like you had mentioned, a lot of your work has been Bigfoot related. Then you have some Mothman stuff, and you switch gears with the Bell Witch, and now you're doing On the Trail of Ghosts. And I'm wondering what brought about that change. This is something totally different, but in the same realm, but different.
Yeah, I don't think it is different. Is the interesting thing. Like Bell Witch, especially Hauntings, is different. But Bell Witch to me was always a natural step following on something like Bray Road or Mothman. You know, I mean, the story elements to the Bell Witch are very similar to our first movie, Minerva Monster. It's like a family in a house. We actually used to refer to Minerva when we were making it as a haunted house movie. And, you know, the way I viewed the Bell Witch, Mark of the Bell Witch, was it's a haunted house movie. And so I guess like it's different in that it's a spirit or a poltergeist rather than a cryptid but at the end of the day, like it really seemed while we were making this, there wasn't a huge leap I had to take or anything I had to like wrap my brain around to really figure out how to tell it. You know, like the story remains fairly similar to the other stuff we've done. The biggest challenge in that one was just the time period. You know, like the switching. We've always had an out or an easy out with our films in that, you know, like if the movie's starting to kind of like slog or whatever in terms of just having experts talk or whatever, you can segue into like a 5-minute section where a witness tells a really scary story. And we didn't have that with Mark of the Bell Witch. The whole movie is experts telling the story. The paranormal, I don't know, for me it's, I get asked that question a lot. I don't really differentiate. Like I said, I set Bigfoot apart from the rest of it, but to me, the paranormal was kind of like all-encompassing. So when we made Hauntings, like Hauntings has been interesting because it's literally the team and I being introduced to that particular subject because none of us have really been into ghosts. It's never been something that we've really spent a lot of time with. Now, I think we all love ghost stories, but none of us are super, you know, none of us were really into like ghost hunting or like going in and trying to have some sort of encounter with a ghost. So that series has been fun just from the perspective of the audience is kind of seeing us being introduced to this, you know, as we're going. But I mean, it is a very like, especially episode 2, but I mean, it's a very comedic kind of series. It's us clearly out of our element, just kind of riffing on each other and you know, we spend a lot of time on the local history and legends in these places, and then there's about an equal amount of time that you're spending with the crew just being complete idiots, which is who we are.
I have not seen anything from it. I haven't seen the screener. I haven't seen any clips or anything. Can you talk about some of the locations that we'll be seeing in this?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's, and I mean, just as an introduction to the series, so I'm not directing it. Adrian and I are producing it. And we haven't done that with the series we haven't done that with any project since On the Trail of Champ in 2018. But Santino Vitali, who's done our special effects for a few years now, was really excited about doing this. You know, his thinking was like, okay, this is a YouTube exclusive series, you know, basically exclusively for our channel members. And then eventually it'll go wide, but it's not going to be for a while. But anyway, we were looking at, or he basically told me what he was trying to do was like a series that was like comedians in cars getting coffee meets Ghost Adventures meets a Casey Neistat blog or vlog, but like with a point. And that was the way he put it. You know, like there's not a point, a purpose. Like the purpose is ghost hunting. And so like, it's a very, like, I don't know, it's very much a return to like guerrilla filmmaking style for SDM. It's all like run and gun, handheld, a lot of like it feels like early Small Town Monsters, but it's also very funny. And instead of us being behind the camera, we're all out in front of the camera throughout. Now, having said that, I do think that the series is doing a really good job of like splitting the difference between crew moments and history and the paranormal focus. I don't think SDM should ever get away from like being focused on that local history, because that's how we got our start. So yeah, that's what the series is. It's very silly and funny at times, and it is like episode 2 gets real creepy just because of the location that we were in. But episode 1, we went to a place called Hanoverton, Ohio, which is sort of, the first 2 episodes are really unknowns in terms of where we are. Hanoverton has a cemetery called Grove Hill Cemetery, and there's a legend about a witch's grave that's in the cemetery, and supposedly this lady was accused of being a witch, and I think she was hung. I think that was what the story was. And before she was hung, she claimed she was going to curse the town. And there were these talismans that were supposedly on the chains that surrounded her grave. She supposedly said before she died that once the final talisman fell off, that the city of Hanover, the town of Hanoverton, the village of Hanoverton would be cursed forever or whatever. There's a version of that story online that states that the earth itself would like swallow up the village of Hanoverton, which is kind of cool. But there's also multiple other local legends in that grave, which is really interesting. So that episode, you spend the first like 15 minutes of that episode kind of learning about the various legends that exist in this one location. There's like a grave with this guy who was buried, and his whole family was buried facing him. And there's just all these like really interesting little side stories in this one place. But it's a graveyard, so we spent like a night walking around this graveyard, and then episode 2 goes to Marietta, Ohio, to a place called the Anchorage Mansion, which was again kind of an unknown. I don't know that either of these locations have really been featured in any like television stuff. The Anchorage Mansion is there was like a rich architect whose wife helped design this house, and then she passed away. The house eventually became abandoned and then was used as a nursing home, and over time it's supposedly become notoriously haunted. So we spent a bunch of time in there interviewing people who've had experiences in there, and then we did our own like night investigation in the house. We had some creepy stuff happen. That episode has like my favorite cold open so far of the couple that he's edited. It's hilarious. And I think that's important too to point out, is like it is as comedic as it is like creepy. It is not a paranormal reality show that takes itself seriously. It's almost like you're seeing it's like combining a ghost hunting show with like a behind the scenes of Small Town Monsters. It's really interesting the way he's doing it. I think it's like when it's all done, it's going to be really cool to see all the episodes together, and we're hoping like his goal with this is just to keep going. Like, I think that we talked about it again today. He has other stories he wants to get to, like Crybaby Bridges and, like all sorts of stuff he wants to get to eventually, once we're done with the initial 6 episodes. But, we'd like it to be an ongoing. Episode 3 is the Mansfield Reformatory, which is a well-known, the Ohio State Penitentiary, Ohio State Reformatory, Mansfield Reformatory. It's a very well-known location. It was the setting for the Shawshank Redemption movie. Yeah. And then, it's on all the ghost hunting shows. I think everyone's been there. We went there and got the entire place for like 12 hours to ourselves, which is wild. And we were able to investigate like all 250,000 square feet, pretty much on our own, just walking through there and spent a lot of time there, did interviews with people who've had encounters. Like Santino told me today, he thinks that'll be an hour-long episode. So the first 2 episodes are around 35 minutes. This episode will probably be more like an hour. And then beyond that, I don't know yet. We don't have locations locked. Like it's a very sort of spontaneous shooting schedule. Like basically Heather Mosier, who's also the host of the show, she'll message us and be like, hey, I got this location locked. Does this date work? And the date might be 2 weeks or it might be 2 days away. So it's like, you don't know. It can happen really fast. And so right now we don't have episode 4's location locked. I do know episode 6, we really are trying to get onto South Bass Island in Lake Erie, which is like really cool. It's also called Put-in Bay, but there's a lighthouse on the island that is supposedly haunted. So we really want to get out there because the setting is so cool, and we want to do that in like the spring before the island gets like inundated with college kids.
So you were talking about the story of Hanoverton. It sounds a lot like the story of Elizabeth Betsy Reed, which is kind of a local story where I'm from. Have you heard about this at all?
I feel like I have.
So this woman supposedly had killed her husband, poisoned him, and was arrested, put into the county jail, and caught it on fire, was able to escape, was captured again, and then she was the first woman that was hung in Illinois. And she was hung for being a witch, not necessarily for murdering her husband. And there's a lot of lore that goes around that, and it's very similar to what you had just said. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of those paranormal, like especially the ghost stories, the curse stories, they have variations. And I don't know if that's I'm not necessarily saying they all derive from the same place. But I did, I thought it was really interesting when we were making the Mark of the Bell Witch, we found there's a version of the Bell Witch story that exists in Mississippi. And it comes out of the same town that Betsy Bell moved to. So after the Bell Witch story, after John Bell's death, after Betsy married Richard Powell, she moved to Mississippi and eventually died there and is buried in Mississippi. There is a version of the Bell Witch story that is event for event pretty much identical. The only thing that's different is that instead of it being a witch, it's a warlock. And so it's very interesting, like, did the story originate with Betsy, and Betsy sort of, like in her version of the Bell Witch story, it was a man instead of a woman, like a warlock instead of a witch, or did at some point someone just screwed the details of who the witch was up, and then it got but either way, it's really interesting. There's this, we just posted for squad members an interview with Brandon Barker, who's like a folklorist, and we interviewed him in the Bell Witch, and he goes in depth on that because he's actually spent a lot of time looking into the Mississippi variation of the story. But I think there's something to that these similar stories exist in different places, but they might have some weird, like, tangential connection to one another.
Yeah, I mean, and the Betsy connection with what I just said is another example of that. It's really it kind of goes back to, like you mentioned earlier, like the Crybaby Bridge thing. Like, everywhere has a Crybaby Bridge.
Right.
And I've said that, we've had a discussion about that before on our show. It's like, if you ask anybody in my area if they know about the Crybaby Bridge, they'll say, yeah. And you say, well, can you tell me where it's at? And every single person will tell you a different bridge in the county.
Yeah. It's always here in Ohio. So we have a place called Egypt Valley, and that's supposedly, I've heard it said that is the Crybaby Bridge, like the first Crybaby Bridge. But I have a book about the Hudson Valley, and Hudson Valley, it's like Hudson Valley's Hauntings and Legends or something like that. And they also claim to have the first Crybaby Bridge. And then, there's a place called Rogues Hollow here in Ohio. It's actually right near where I live, and they have a Crybaby Bridge there. Then there's a place called Canal Fulton. These places are all within 20 minutes of each other, is what's interesting. But they've all got these Crybaby Bridges. But yeah, there's stories. There's Crybaby Bridges, Gateways to Hell, and Gravity Hills. They're like everywhere. And then you usually have like spook light stories.
I want to change gears just a little bit. The last episode of your podcast, Monsteropolis, that I listened to, and it may be the last one. I'm not sure if you've put up the next one yet. You were talking about Kentucky and the Mammoth Cave System, and a bunch of different things that you mentioned, and you brought up an entrance to the Hollow Earth. Yeah. Can you elaborate on that at all, or is that giving away your podcast?
No, it's not. I just posted the full. So I'm not sure if you actually listened to the Mammoth Cave episode. We just posted the full Mammoth Cave episode today, but we have.
No, I haven't listened to it yet, but I'm going to.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and I want to. So we also posted for squad members. We actually shot video while we were in Mammoth Cave, and then I kind of overlaid that with the audio from that episode, and we basically made a mini documentary. And that is, the Mammoth Cave episode is extremely long for Monsteropolis. It's like an hour and 12 minutes or something.
I can't wait.
Yeah, what happened was, and I do talk about this on the episode. What happened was I was researching I don't know why I went down that particular trail so hard, but I got really interested in Mammoth Cave, and I started doing all this research for that episode. And I discovered that there used to be a passageway called, I'm going to screw this up, I think it was Symes Branch something. It was there was a passageway in Mammoth Cave that they named after this guy named, I think his last name is Symes. I'm saying this and I don't have my notes in front of me from that episode.
That's okay.
So I'm probably screwing it up. But basically, it boils down to the guy was the passageway was named after the man that sort of populated the Hollow Earth theory. And at the end of the passageway is what they call the bottomless pit. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you can still get there or not, but at one time it was one of the big tourist attractions in the cave. And this would have been sort of before the cave became a national park even. So it's when it was a big tourist attraction. So they would put, there'd be landmarks within the cave.
Yep.
One of them was something about hell. And then there was the Devil's Looking Glass and all these different, they give these different names to different parts of the cave, and then, people would go see those things. The bottomless pit was at the end of this passageway. And so, that guy, what's interesting is the guy that populated that theory did come to live in Kentucky. And as far as I can find, I don't think he ever actually went to the cave or had anything to do with the cave, but which is interesting because I'm not sure if that's where this theory grows out of, but there is a popular theory that I discovered on Reddit where there's a Reddit thread all about the Hollow Earth. Mm-hmm. And there's this thing about there being seven entrances to the Hollow Earth.
Yep.
Oh, you knew about this. Okay.
Oh, yeah. No, but go on.
Okay. Well, I don't. So you probably know way more about it than I do. I just was kind of going off. But supposedly the big theory is that the Mammoth Cave is one of those 7 entrances to the Hollow Earth, that Symes, if that's his name, moved to Kentucky because he knew this and was actually exploring the cave trying to find that entrance. They named that passageway after him almost as a joke from what I could find. Yeah, basically it just boils down to a lot of people think that the Mammoth Cave is an entrance to the Hollow Earth. And there's a lot of weird stories that relate back to the Mammoth Cave area. There's a lizard man report that we talk about on this episode of Monsteropolis where a guy that lived near a creek, which runs into a river, which runs into the Mammoth Cave or out of the Mammoth Cave. He lived near this creek, and he encountered a lizard person, like an amphibious creature of some sort, along the banks of this creek. There's stories about mummies that were found in the cave, and supposedly there's all these stories about like red-haired giants, and apparently the Lexington mummies, which are those like red-haired giants, those somehow have a tie to Mammoth Cave as well, and the mummies. And supposedly, like, basically there were mummies, red-haired giant mummies found in Mammoth Cave. They were taken to the Smithsonian and hidden away, is kind of like one of the theories. But yeah, that episode goes into all the weirdness connected with the caves, from like ghost stories to mummies and everything in between.
I love it. It's become a big part of my personal research. Mm-hmm. And I've alluded to a few different things here on the show, but a lot of it's still under wraps. In your researching in your time with Kentucky, have you gone to Western Kentucky much? Western Kentucky. Like Paducah area?
So we used to do a Civil War show or something in Paducah when I was a kid, because the second you said Paducah, I remember being there a lot as a kid, but it's been so long. So I know I've been to Western Kentucky. I just can't think of what that area is like.
Well, it's really quiet.
Yeah. Well, that's most of Kentucky.
Yeah, well, so just, I don't know, maybe less than 30 minutes east of Paducah, there's a little town called Smithland. Mm-hmm. And Smithland has a historical building that was a storage depot basically in the Civil War. So makes sense that you would go to Civil War things in Paducah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to ask people about if they know anything about Western Kentucky, because I'm pulling every thread that I can see and trying to get as much information as I can, because there's some really weird stuff in that area.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I think Kentucky is massively overlooked. Like, we haven't even done anything in Kentucky yet, like for the films. It's overlooked, but there's a lot of like really weird stories. What I'm curious about is why you can't. It's very difficult to find books about Kentucky weirdness. Like, there's a guy named Barton Nunnally who's done a couple books, but those are basically like just his own research, and it's just strange that it's so, it's a neighboring state to West Virginia, which to me is kind of, it's the weirdest state in America. I don't care what anyone says. Like, when it comes to paranormal activity, I don't think it gets any weirder than West Virginia. And Kentucky's a neighboring state, but I just feel like no one really focuses on the paranormal in Kentucky. I guess the Hellier people did a little.
Yeah, there's a growing group of us.
Yeah.
The Pennyroyal guys are leading the charge at this point. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's really, Kentucky's a weird place, man.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to get there maybe next year or something. We'll see.
And you had mentioned, there's not really like a collective Kentucky paranormal book, but it's weird because in almost all of like the collection stories, like every page is going to have like one thing about Kentucky. Mm-hmm. Like, it pops up in everything else, but there is no dedicated, like...
Yeah, that's kind of what... Yeah, right, that's kind of what I meant, is, like, you can find books about every state, specifically, multiple books. Like, Ohio has tons of books about the paranormal in Ohio, but Kentucky, I have a hard time, like, digging stuff up.
One more thing before I let you off of here is you guys have a Kickstarter launch coming up.
Yeah, on Thursday, February 4th, the launch is at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and then the campaign will run till March 4th. And it's to fund On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Journey, On the Trail of UFOs, Dark Sky, The Howl of the Rougarou, and On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Discovery. 2 of those are already filmed and into post-production. So, the Kickstarter will fund post-production costs for Bigfoot, The Journey, and UFOs Dark Sky, and then full production costs for Howl of the Rougarou and Bigfoot, The Discovery. Bigfoot, The Journey is like a very personal story. It's about a trip that me and some friends took. Me and Mark Matsky, actually, from Monsteropolis. I said to Mark the other day that I feel like this is, or Monsteropolis, the film. It just feels rooted in that stuff. But it's about our trip to the Adirondacks last summer, and we basically documented the entire trip and then interviewed a lot of witnesses and investigators, and it's a continuation of what we already did with On the Trail of Bigfoot, but it's also like something a little different. That will be our first release, and then On the Trail of UFOs is a really extensive look into West Virginia's UFO history. And like I said, it gets into like Men in Black and Injured Cold and UFOs coming out of coal mines and all sorts of fun stuff. And then
right up my alley.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mine too. And then How the Rougarou will be out later in the year. And then On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Discovery, we are going back to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington and Oregon. And we're going to go out with this group, the Olympic Project, spend a lot of time with them. They have some really like crazy stuff that they're working on, like next level. I hesitate to say proof, because God only knows if we'll ever actually prove that anything exists. But they're like on the border of some really crazy like advances in the subject. So we'll do that, and then there's like all sorts of rewards and stuff, T-shirts and posters and DVDs, Blu-rays, original artwork, executive producer credits in the movies, digital rewards, and all that stuff. So there's we do like a live launch party on Facebook and YouTube where we give stuff away, and we just came across 3 different Gene St. Jean statues of, like Gene does these statues every year for the Kickstarter. This year he's doing it with Flatwoods Monster, which we haven't actually announced yet. But he's doing a Flatwoods Monster statue. We just found a Mothman, a Bray Road Beast, and a Momo, I think, statue. And so we're going to give those away during the live launch party. So if you tune in, you might win stuff too.
There's a good chance I would do terrible things for that Mothman statue.
Yeah, he actually sells them. Gene sells them on his store, but they're pretty great.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so where can people find your work and all of that good stuff? I know you have the podcast and, of course, all of the documentaries. And is there a collective place?
Yeah, smalltownmonsters.com is kind of the home for everything. Yeah, smalltownmonsters.com, and then YouTube. We're posting more and more stuff there, like not just trailers, but clips from the movies. And like I said, we will be launching more YouTube stuff over the next year. And then there's also the members only section of our YouTube channel. That's where you can see On the Trail of Hauntings and stuff like that. So yeah, on the smalltownmonsters.com and smalltownmonsters.com/store, I think it is where you can actually buy DVDs and stuff like that. But if you want to just watch our movies, they're on most major streaming platforms, but you're guaranteed to find all of them on Amazon.
That sounds awesome. Seth, thank you so much for coming on Paranormal Patio, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I've been Jason, my guest tonight, Seth Breedlove. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Until next time, keep the fire going.